I recently uploaded my latest tutorial to Patreon featuring this rather adorable Meerkat, created using soft pastels and pastel pencils on 30 by 40 centimeters Pastelmat board. As a thank you for the continued love and support here on YouTube, I'll now share an in-depth preview of this tutorial. If at any point you would like to watch it in full, including steps on how to get started on the accurate outlines and the full materials list, you can find the link to my Patreon in the description. Enjoy! So once the accurate outlines are in place, I first get to work using a dark pastel stick to map out some of those darkest areas. Here I'm using the Unison Grey 13. I'm really not applying too much pressure, I'm sort of just letting the pastel stick glide along the surface, and you can see in these areas that the paper is still slightly showing through, which is great, as with soft pastel sticks a little definitely goes a long way, so you don't want to press hard and fill in all of the paper because that's just going to make it really hard for any pencil details to go on top in future layers. So keep in mind when applying pigments with your pastel stick to just sort of let it glide along the surface, and that'll be more than enough because when you come to blend that all out, you'll see that the paper gets very easily covered with that pigment. So in this particular area of the Meerkat's body, you can see that overall the fur is quite light in this area, but we have that darker underneath, as there's less fur density in this area, meaning we have more of that dark background showing through. So I'm just getting these dark pigments in there, and then we can sort of cover it up with lighter hairs on top as we see it in the reference photo. But for now, this is just a mapping out stage, so continuing with just some of those darker areas, and here I'm just going to take the Cretacolor Black Chalk Pencil, and this is the darkest black on the market, and going back to the eye area, I'm simply just going to draw in all of those jet black details. So we can see for the eyes themselves, they are very dark, so I can just go straight in with this pencil. And the reason I'm using a pencil and not a pastel stick is just because it can be a bit more precise and it gives me a bit more control. And I can also fill in other detailed areas such as the nostrils, which are also jet black. So again, I'm sort of just working from dark to light, first filling out those darkest areas, and then I'll work to some of the midtones and then the lighter areas, and that's just personally how I've always processed through a pastel portrait. Okay, so back to using the soft pastel sticks now, and I'm going to again continue filling in the base layer for the fur. Now you might be a bit confused why I'm using this sort of dark grey colour here, when in the reference photo the fur looks quite light, and this is because this is just the base layer on which those highlights will sit. So if we take a look at this other photo of a Meerkat, you can see this more clearly where we have darker values and tones underneath and in between those highlight hairs. So the base layer here, which I'm creating for my pencil highlights to sit on top of, is just going to represent that darker color underneath. So it might look a bit funny in these beginning stages, and I will be mixing other lighter colors in with this darker gray color, so it's not just going to look like this, don't worry. But until we start to draw those highlight hairs on top, it might look a bit funny but in the base layer, but you'll quickly see as we work through the steps why and how this layering process works. So here on top of that cool gray, you can see I'm also mixing in some neutral grays here, and you can see that I've left some of the paper blank already, and this is where we have some of those lightest values. So to blend all of this soft pastel pigment out, I'm going to use my soft sponge tool, first starting with and continuing on with some of these midtones. But first up here, I'm going to put on my respiratory mask, because blending out the pastel like this can be quite a dusty task, and it's very good practice to keep your lungs safe during the process. I also have an air purifier in my studio, and this also helps to keep the air clean. If you're new to using these soft sponge tools, then it's important that you stick to blending similar colors and values at one time. So for example, if I started to blend out all of the very dark pigment and allowed it to become embedded into the sponge, and then took my sponge straight to some of those lighter areas, I'm going to unwantedly transfer over those darker pigments into those lighter areas, and the same can be done vice versa. This is how you can end up muddying your colors, unfortunately, so always stick to the same or similar colors and values, and then as you work through the piece, gradually pick up lighter or darker colors depending on what sort of areas you would like to blend next. So you can see for this portrait in particular, I've gradually started to pick up darker pigments. These will start to embed into my sponge so that I can safely continue into those darker and darker areas gradually, so that I don't transfer over any unwanted lighter pigments. Gradually shifting between different values like this is really important to make sure that our colors remain pure. Okay, so just continuing with the darker value areas now, so I'm going to blend all of that pigment out that we see for the ears, and then also make my way down to the shadowy patches on the body. You might think that I should do the eye area as well, but I'm actually going to leave that till a little bit later, just because I'll use a small detailed sponge for that, as it will give me more control. The eyes are one of the most important aspects to a portrait, so I like to be extra careful and precise in those areas especially. So then I'm left with quite a lot of dark pigment embedded into my sponge, and now you can see I need to blend out those lightest grey areas. So I can either get a brand new sponge head, or I can just take some spare piece of Pastelmat board, apply that to light cold grey pigment to it, and then pick that up with my sponge. You can see here now I have those lighter pigments embedded, and I can go straight onto my artwork and start blending with this sponge without worrying about transferring a huge dark streak into the lighter areas. It's still important that you keep a relatively light pressure with your sponge once doing this, because if you press too hard, the darker pigments are still going to be embedded into the sponge. So if you press really hard, then they will eventually start to come through and darken your area. So just be mindful with your pressure. But anyway, it's good practice to always keep a relatively light pressure with your sponge tool when blending out regardless, as this way you'll always have the smoothest blend possible. So as I'm blending, I'm making sure to incorporate the different sections and areas together for a smooth, even finish. We don't want any harsh lines or borders between the different sections within this base layer. Any detail or definition we will add only with our pastel pencils. So for that, we want this base color layer to be essentially a slightly darker, soft and blurry version of what we see in the reference image. I'm also able to continue picking up that lighter pigment on my scrap Pastelmat board as I go through blending out these lighter areas, and this is just helping. Okay, so the very first thing I want to do when refining this base layer in particular is to get a kneadable eraser and sort of mold it into a flat shape, and then just gently lift off the excess pastel pigment throughout. I simply do this by very lightly swiping the eraser on my base layer. There are going to be some areas that have more pastel and are denser, and just carefully wiping off the excess like this is going to give our pastel pencils the best chance to deposit their pigments on top. When there's too much pastel pigment in our base layer, it fills in the tooth of the paper, making it harder for pastel pencils to deposit their pigments on top. So this is why I like to use the kneadable eraser. As long as I keep a light even pressure and don't press too hard, I shouldn't really erase anything noticeable, just the excess pigments which aren't going to affect how the base layer looks. So I'm then going to take a scrap piece of Pastelmat board and add some more colours and tones to it. Some will be on the more vibrant side, but I can mix and combine the colours together here before applying them to my base layer. This is another reason I love the sponge transfer method here, because you can really figure out all of your colours and tones before you commit them to your artwork. And as I've mentioned in other tutorials, the sponge transfer method is the lightest and thinnest way to apply soft pastel pigments to your artwork, so you don't really need to worry about filling in the tooth of the paper. So you can see here I've picked up these warm pigments, and this is with the Unison colour NE16. I can then combine and mix this with my light cold grey, and this gives me a whole new colour, perfect for what I'm looking for in this area. So this is really using the blendability of pastels to our advantage, because we're not going to have every single colour and tone that we're looking for, so the sponge transfer method is a really great way to mix those colours before committing them to your artwork. You can see in the reference that we have hints of those warmer colours and tones throughout some of the lighter values of our Meerkat, so this refining process is going to be really helpful for the accuracy of the final outcome. I'll just start speeding up some of the process here, but you can see that I'm starting to incorporate even some of those increasingly vibrant warm colours into my colour mixture, just when I need that extra pop of colour. So again, as I'm transferring these pigments in, it's important that I'm only using a light pressure with my sponge and to take my time to gradually build up the refinement layer. I'm sort of just dabbing it on top. It's really handy because sometimes when you're first creating the initial base layer, it's quite hard to exactly colour match to the reference image. So knowing that I'm able to take the time to refine the base layer in this way with the sponge transfer method takes some of the pressure off getting it perfect straight away. So here under the mouth and chin area, when looking at the reference, we can see those hints of warm brown colours. So I'm going to pick up some warm browns into my colour mixture and add this vibrancy in here. My plan is not to make it as brown or vibrant as I see in the reference image. I sort of want my artwork to have a slightly more muted colour, and that's just my personal preference. If you're drawing alongside me, feel free to adjust the colours or tones however you want, or just follow the reference photo exactly if that's what you prefer to do. So we can see some brown colours down here too for the body, so I'll be sure to add them in also. I definitely have a slow and steady approach when it comes to creating animal portraits, but that's what I found works best for me. I'm sure it probably takes longer than some other methods, but I have found it to produce the best outcomes. So moving on to the body here, I can see some of these warm yellow tones sort of mix in with these cooler grey colours. So you can see by adding in this refinement on top of that cold grey layer, we're close to matching what is happening in the reference. I'm actually not thinking too hard about these specific colours, rather just the values, so how light or dark they are, and also the temperature, so how cool or warm the colours are. But here you can see how this refinement layer is also mixing with the initial base layer that we've already put down, so I'm not necessarily covering it with complete new pigments, but rather this refinement layer is slightly mixing with the base layer that we already have. Okay, so now for the fun and long part. This is where we can start to add all of the detail and definition for the Meerkat using our pastel pencils. Here I'm first using the grey Carbothello 704, and I'm just going to use it to draw some of the hairs that fly out into the background and also overlap that dark ear area. When drawing such hairs, it's handy to start with a neutral grey like this, which isn't too bright, and if we need to, we can add brighter hairs on top in future layers. It would look a bit flat if we just went straight in with the bright pencils, so it definitely helps to build up the layers and work from dark to light. Again here I'm using the Carbothello 724 at the very edge of the ear just to help it fade into the background slightly so that those dark values are not so harsh against the grey of the paper. I'll then continue to add more flyaway hairs, aiming to flick my lines off and bend them slightly for a realistic appearance. So now I've got that first layer of detail down with the neutral grey, I can go on top with the much lighter Carbothello Ivory 105 and just start to follow the same pattern and draw on top of that layer. I'll also very lightly add in some neutral yellowy orange vibrancy with the Bruynzeel 48 for that pop of colour that I can see in the reference image, but as I'm drawing in these hairs on top, hopefully you can see why it's beneficial to start with that darker grey pencil first. It really helps to elevate these lighter hairs that I'm putting down now. It makes for a more dynamic texture as it looks like we have darker and brighter highlight hairs within the area, which is what is occurring in real life too. This is pretty much what I will do throughout the whole portrait. Go in first with a mapping out layer to figure out some of the flow direction of the fur, and then draw on top of that with brighter and more intense pencils, pretty much following what I previously put down. The combination of two or more layers really adds a realistic dynamic to the texture, which I think shouldn't be overlooked. So I'll talk about this more as the portrait goes on, but to draw realistic hairs in here you can see I hold my pencil a bit further back, and that just allows me to be a bit more expressive and loose with my lines. So for realistic hairs we don't want each hair to look like a carbon copy of the previous one, we want to keep adding in some sense of randomness, as in real life obviously every hair is unique and sort of flicking off and bending in all different ways, so that's what I need to aim to replicate with my pastel pencil. So now taking the Carbothello 700, which you can see is this very light grey, and I'm just going to start drawing in the highlighted hairs here, paying attention to what direction they're flowing in, but also the lengths of each of these hairs, so I would say they're a little bit shorter than ones we previously drew in, and I'm just slowly building up that lighter value that I can see in this particular area, which also helps to carve out this area of the snout. As we add in these lighter values here and then leave some of those other sections to be darker midtones, you can see some sort of 3D depth start to emerge as different parts of the face seem to appear in front or behind other parts. So you can already see that the nose area looks as though it's starting to protrude out from the face, producing that realistic sense of depth, and that simply is created just by the change in value, so how light or dark some of these sections are. When some of the hairs are less intense and less bright, I can just use a darker grey to start filling out that texture, still making sure to think about what direction the fur is flowing in and how long or short it is. And then for areas which are brighter again, I can go back to using the lighter grey pencil. Just like with the first ear section, it typically helps to do a slightly darker layer of highlights first, a sort of mapping out stage to figure out what direction everything is flowing in, and then when you're happy with how that's looking, you can go on top with brighter and more intense pencils to really bring out the brightness and intensity where necessary. Before I start adding some of the hairs for the chin area here, I'm just going to lightly shade in some more of those blue tones with the Carbothello 724 and then very lightly draw in some wispy and thin lines using the Carbothello Light Grey 700. The hairs here are slightly curved and bend around, so I'll be sure to do the same with my pencil. Again, it helps to hold the pencil a bit further back so that I can be more expressive with these lines, and I've also sharpened my pencil to a flat tip point, which allows me to get these really thin, fine hairs, along with a relatively light pressure, because if I apply too much pressure, the lines will be thicker. Some of the other hairs on the lower mouth area here are less bright and intense, so I can switch back to using that darker grey, which is again the 704 from Carbothello, and mainly just really focusing on the lengths of these hairs. Obviously they start to bend around the other way as we come around to the other side, and I'm also thinking about the gaps in between each hair as well, because we still want to see some of that dark base layer showing through as we see it happening on the reference image. We don't want to add these lines too close together so that it completely covers up that base layer, and then we're not going to have any sense of depth. We still need those darker values to show through in between these highlighted hairs, and that's going to give us a really healthy, realistic sense. Okay, so quickly back to the white, I'm just adding a few select highlight hairs within this area. You can see I'm spacing them quite a bit further apart, so I'm just picking out a few on top, not lightening too much of the area, and then I'll use the light grey Caran dash to really make those eye reflections shine. So I don't want to cover up that lovely vibrant blue colour, but just add in these light reflections to some of it. So again, I'm making sure that I have a sharp tip, and I'm sort of just dabbing these dots on top. Again, the Caran dash are a very soft brand of pastel pencils, so they're going to find it easy to deposit their pigments on top of many layers. So sticking with this light grey Caran dash, I'll also do the same for some of the small detailing and texture on the nose here. So again, essentially just adding in these dots on top and just picking out those small details and textures on the nose where the light is hitting. As I come into some of the darker areas here, I'm just making sure to apply even less pressure just so that these dots are a bit more subtle. I'm just going to pick out a few more final highlights with the Caran dash Chinese white. Okay, so I want to start drawing some of these whiskers that flick out into the background, and for that I'm going to use the dark grey Faber-Castell 175, holding the pencil a bit further back, making sure I have a sharp tip, and I'm sort of just flicking these lines off and slightly curving them as I do as well. I'm not necessarily following the reference photo exactly as I see it, but just aiming to get the rough sort of length and shape of these hairs. But really you can see how holding my pencil a bit further back is just allowing me to be very expressive with these lines, and it allows me to easily flick them off for that realistic appearance. If I was to hold the pencil quite close to the tip and I was slow and controlled, then these lines wouldn't look very good, and they would just sort of look like stumpy lines rather than just whiskers. So once I've got a few of those dark lines in place, I can also add some light lines. That's the great thing about having a neutral grey background such as the dark grey Pastelmat that I'm working on here. I can add both dark and light details and both will show on that background. So for these lighter lines I'm using the 704. I'm then going to switch to using the black Carbothello pastel pencil. I'm going to add some dots here next to the nose for where those whiskers grow out, so then once they're in place I'll just do the same process of holding my pencil a bit further back and just flicking those lines off while also curving them as I go around as well. And obviously each whisker is unique and different, so I make sure that they each have a different length and a slight different shape as well, but following the same general direction and shape. Okay, so we're moving on down to the body for step 6, and this is going to be straightforward because we're essentially repeating the exact same process, methods and techniques as we did for the face area, just with longer fur. So first up here I'm using my subtle highlight pencils to create a first layer of highlights. In the slightly darker areas I'll use the Carbothello 704, and then in the areas with brighter values I'll just go straight in with the lighter Carbothello 700. I'm just really focusing on the particular direction the hair is flowing and also the lengths of each of the hairs. All while using a light pressure, I'm slowly going to build up these layers by using more intense and brighter pencils on top, so essentially working from dark to light but also from subtle to intense. We want to save our intense pencils such as the Caran dash till the final layers. And remember, you can always mix and combine pencils together to achieve those exact tones or values that you're looking for. So again here on the other side, I'm going to start drawing in these hairs that grow out from that dark centre parting and bend them around the neck as they grow, making sure to achieve that same curved line. I'm then using the black Carbothello with a very light pressure because it is too dark for this area, just to enhance some of these dark gaps here, adding in more texture to the area, but also helping to darken the overall value of this shadowed section underneath the chin. I'll then switch to using the slightly less intense dark grey Faber-Castell 175 and continue with these dark gaps further down. This is sort of a mapping out stage to figure out the flow direction of all the fur while also adding in texture and increasing the contrast before any highlights even get drawn in. I can then begin to draw the highlights around these dark gaps, and it will be easier as I have already started to figure out what direction the fur is growing in the area. So again, back to the subtle highlight pencils, just really figuring out what direction the fur is flowing, because it does change quite a lot here. I'm being sure to use a light pressure and to take a slow and gradual approach. We will work with more intense pencils on top if we need to in future layers, but right now I'm just taking the time and continuing to map out the flow directions with a light pressure. Here in the underside of the meerkat's face, you can see things are in shadow and there's not as much detail here, so I can just go ahead with that more subtle neutral grey and just pick out a few hair details here. I'm not going to go crazy with the details because when we look at the reference we can see that things aren't that defined, so I'll only draw a few subtle hairs in here. I'll then switch back to using the light grey 700 Carbothello and continue with the hair details to the left side of the body here and just start to map out the flow direction for all the fur in this area. Again, so we have that dark patch here, which we've just drawn in some of the dark gaps for as well. So I'll be sure to leave quite a few gaps in between these highlighted hairs so that we still have some of that dark base layer showing through as we see it happening in the reference image. We don't want to cover it, so I'll make sure to space these lines out apart. Obviously the hair on the body here is much longer than a lot of the previous details we've been drawing in, so I'll be sure to do long continued strokes with my pencil. Again, you can see I've got a I already know the process by now as we did the exact same and completed for the face area, but now I'm switching to the Caran pastel pencils, which are brighter and more intense, first going on top with the grey 802. And for these brighter pencils I simply want to follow the reference photo and see where those brightest values are in particular, and you can see that they're quite intense in this part of the left side of the body. I've already mapped out the flow direction of the fur here, so all I need to do is follow the same pattern and lengths while thinking about how to space these lines apart too. I don't want to draw them too close together. I still need some of the darker values to show through in between and underneath, otherwise we will lose the texture and depth, similar to how the right side of the body appears. However, this side of the body has lots of lovely texture, so we need to make sure that both our dark and light values show within the fur texture, and that's how we're going to achieve a realistic sense of depth. And obviously here, as we make our way towards that darker patch and the flow direction of the fur changes, I'll be sure to replicate that, and you can see that some of the hairs here are shorter as well as they're poking up through the fur, so make sure you're always paying attention to the lengths of these hairs as well. And just generally try and keep things random, so you don't want every hair to look like a carbon copy. You want them each to be a bit unique, so keep changing and tweaking the lengths and also slightly change the directions and curves as well, and that's really going to lend itself to a realistic appearance. But one of the main important things here is just keeping those values in check. Constantly compare and contrast the different sections and ask yourself, is this area brighter or darker than this area? And by doing that throughout, you'll be able to represent the reference photo faithfully. The lighting and values affects everything about how 3D the animal portrait looks, so it's really important that they're correct. Slowly build up from dark to light and take your time doing so. When looking at the reference, a lot of the light fur for the body has that blue underlying tint to it, so before I go on top with the final highlights, I'm going to take the Carbothello 724, which we've previously used, make sure that the tip is sharp and very lightly shade in these underlying tones on top. I need to make sure that I only use a very light pressure, barely letting the tip touch the paper, to lightly add these pigments in. Inevitably this will reduce the definition of the details, but not by too much. But nevertheless, this is why I wouldn't add in these tones after the final highlights, because it can reduce the detail and definition. So this is why I'm doing it now before those final pencils get added on. Hopefully here you can see how this subtle pop of blue underlying colour is really adding a whole new dimension and sense of realism to the fur. As I've mentioned before, I always love to see within reason what interesting colours and tones I can include, because it definitely makes the artwork more interesting to look at. Okay, so now I'm going to spend a bit of time going back on top with the grey Caran 802 just to add some more details in the areas which I think need it. So I'm looking back and forth the reference and just seeing what parts need to be brighter or have more texture, for example, just following the... So that now concludes this Meerkat tutorial preview. You can find the full tutorial over on my Patreon now, along with many other lessons included in your subscription. On Patreon, there are beginner-friendly lessons for soft pastels, graphite and oil paint with a wide range of subject matter. I often get asked about how I create my artworks. Patreon is where I share all of my favourite and must-know art tips from my years of experience. With each tutorial, you will learn my go-to methods and techniques for both the materials and tools. Our time is valuable, so I've made sure that my lessons are efficient and straight to the point, so that you can quickly learn and take away the skills and knowledge that you need to know for any artworks that you wish to create. Once subscribed, you instantly unlock access to all of the lessons available on my Patreon to start learning from straight away. Subscriptions are monthly with no contract, so you can cancel at any time. To find out more, feel free to visit the link to my Patreon in this video's description. If you would also like to take a look at the lesson catalogue before joining, I have a dedicated page on my website showcasing each video, which will also be linked below. Before you go, why not pick up my free beginner's soft pastel guide? It's yours to download and keep forever.